One last time, and just as you tidy up the house, you feel better if you can get rid of some rubbish, and the rubbish would be anybody who disagreed theologically with the Covenanters.
These ministers were convinced that they had the godly right to discipline Scotland. They wanted to stop people being drunk. They wanted to stop people going out dancing. They wanted to stop people generally having a good time. It would be like living under the mullahs in Iran. But the idea was to create a perfect Scotland, a perfectly reformed Scotland, a godly Scotland.
These same very radical ministers were people who tended to have a great concern about educating ordinary people, seeing that they went to school, seeing that they learnt to read the Bible. So I think it's vastly overstated to say that this was some sort of terrible theocratic regime. Yes, these people were very intolerant to the royalists, but we'd just been through war after war. Regimes which are born in that sort of way tend to be intolerant, and they tend to be short-lived.
In fact, the Covenanting regime would soon be rocked by deeply shocking news. While their revolutionary movement had been happy to depose Charles, the Covenanters had never expected what was to follow. Cromwell executed their king.
Now you might say, why on earth did they care about the king when they'd fought against him and opposed him all along? Scotland had two great points of national pride. One was we thought we had the best reformed religion in the world. The other was we thought we had the oldest monarchy in the world. And to lose our king, people were shocked by it. They didn't want Charles killed. They wanted him to repent. They wanted him to change his heart, to take the covenant and come back and be their king.
It was probably a majority who emerged from the woodwork, really, who said, well, where are we in Scotland? If we don't have a king, we really don't have a constitution. It's only the kingship which gives us any kind of a sense of history and identity. And I think this caused profound anxieties.
So just 3 days after the execution of Charles I, they declared his son King Charles II.
Safe in exile in the Netherlands, 19-year-old Charles II needed convincing. Bailey was one of the leading Covenanters sent to persuade the young heir to the throne that Scotland genuinely wanted him as their king, on one condition, that he sign the Covenants. Bailey was probably aware of how it looked for the Covenanters to be going cap in hand to the son of the monarch they had unwittingly sent to the axe barely months before. But Bailey and his colleagues also knew that young Charles had little option. If he wished for any power, he would have to agree to the Covenanters' agenda. So on a nervous trip to Scotland, Charles reluctantly signed the Covenants and became puppet king of Covenanters Scotland.
Here is a man possessed of quite a lively intellect, a man who really enjoys life. He loves the wine, the women, the song, and all the rest of it, and he ends up in Covenanting Scotland. What a fate.
Cromwell, now head of the English parliamentarian army, was furious about this expression of loyalty to the crown. He'd barely got rid of one king, only for the Covenanters to bring in another. So Cromwell invaded Scotland. The Covenanters' defences collapsed with pathetic swiftness. They'd now been conquered by the forces with whom they'd been allies until so recently. With a hostile English army on his tail and barely concealed disdain for the Covenanter regime he had sided with, Charles II fled back to the continent. The hopeless rout at Cromwell's hands split the Covenanters. Bitter recriminations were traded about who was responsible for their abject military failure.
After Cromwell's conquest of Scotland, everyone fell out. How could their God have allowed this to happen to them? They who had perfected themselves under the covenant, how could this have happened? Now, there was two interpretations of this. The godly maintained that they hadn't been pure enough, that in fact what they should have done was purge themselves of all malignants, have created a godly army, have only had a godly parliament, and that way they would have succeeded and God would have blessed them. The more worldly Presbyterians took a differing interpretation. They thought that you should make political alliances with other people and therefore you might actually succeed in your aims.
And these two groups started to try and get Cromwell's favour. They started to try and get Cromwell on their side, backing them in Scotland so they could get their ministers put into the parishes of Scotland.
Heading the political camp was a smooth-talking negotiator, the Reverend James Sharp, minister of Crail. Sharp, ambitious son of a sheriff clerk, had quickly risen through the ranks of the moderates thanks to a gift for diplomacy and a talent for networking. And rising to prominence within the uncompromising godly camp was the extremist Waterston. Waterston and Sharp became bitter enemies, vying for influence with Cromwell in London. A Puritan with much in common with the radical Covenanters, Cromwell naturally favoured Waterston's camp over Sharp's. But barely 7 years after the conquest of Scotland, Cromwell died. With Cromwell gone, it became clear that only his iron grip had held the regime together. Without him, England faced near anarchy and a power vacuum to be filled.
His failure to put in place any viable alternative to the monarchy left the way open for the son of poor dead Charles to succeed him. Initially, the Covenanters took this as good news. Okay, they'd handed Charles Sr. over to the parliamentarians, but Charles Jr. had signed the covenant. Surely this was the beginning of a bright new era for Presbyterians. Sadly, not.
The Covenanters were hopelessly weakened by their eagerness to please the restored monarch, now back from the continent again, this time as all-powerful King of Britain. Loyalty to Charles now determined the fates of the Covenanters. Bailey the Moderate was content to serve the king. The reward for his acquiescence was to be appointed principal of Glasgow University. Sharp, the sly negotiator, did even better. Sent by the Covenanters to plead their case at Charles' court, to their horror, he returned as Episcopalian Archbishop of St. Andrews. It was a staggering betrayal. His rival Waterston, the Covenanter firebrand, was not so lucky. He had colluded with Cromwell, the very man who had executed Charles II's father. Only one possible fate awaited Waterston: death. Royal propaganda spin couldn't have hoped for a more pitiful figure. Here was the fearsome torch-bearer of the Covenant begging for mercy, unable to recognize his own children, sobbing that he'd forgotten the Bible. He asked his enemies to repent, then said goodbye to his family and dear Scotland. Waterston was hanged. His head was hacked off and displayed for all to see.
Before long, the true extent of Charles' intentions became clear. He cancelled all the legislation put in place by the Presbyterians. The covenant was declared illegal, and all ministers ordained since his father's execution had to seek reordination. Charles was out for revenge.
He brought bishops back. He eliminated the Covenanters' revolutionary leaders. Charles was squeezing the life out of the Covenanter struggle. Or so he thought. Out in the countryside, trouble was once again brewing. Rebelling against the reimposition of bishops, a third of all the ministers simply walked out of their churches. Thousands of Covenanters defiantly left their pews and followed their ministers into the wilds. As Charles tightened his grip on the Covenanters, the most faithful of them slipped through his fingers and into the hills. Outdoor gatherings of the faithful began to spread across the Scottish countryside like an epidemic. These were the conventicles, the next phase in the arms race of Covenanter resistance.
You could meet on the moors miles from anywhere. In a way, it's a bit like going to an illegal rave. You know, you pass around of where you're going to meet and you sneak out there and you all gather together.
And it started to snowball. As it went on, more and more people joined this movement until it got to conventicles of 10,000 people. all meeting and in defiance of royal authority.
The Bible is full of stories of God meeting his persecuted servants on hill and mountaintop and strengthening them for the struggle. Scotland, being a land of hills and mountains, has always taken that bit of the Bible to its heart. So it's not difficult to think of the thousands of Covenanters who gathered on this hill for the great communion celebration, sitting on these ancient stones and finding God's strength pouring into them. The boycotting of church services got so bad in the southwest of Scotland that the government sent in the military to extract fines from non-attenders any way they saw fit. Now the Covenanters discovered that even their outdoor worship had been declared illegal. Troops began to arrive to break up their meetings. Fines and imprisonment rained down on redoubtable ministers and their flocks. They had no effect. They would not budge. When the methods got out of hand and an elderly man was threatened with torture, the local Covenanters took matters into their own hands. They seized the soldiers and raised an army to march on Edinburgh. But they were disorganized and badly led. At Rullion Green in the Pentland Hills, they were defeated and hundreds were taken prisoner. Warrison's old rival, royal lapdog James Sharp, mercilessly exercised his new powers as Archbishop. He called for prisoners to be executed. It sealed his turncoat reputation. But the crackdown did not stop with the radicals. Even moderate Presbyterians began to suffer from a widening campaign of persecution.
It was like belonging to a second-class, despised group. It could stop you getting a job. If you were in an area that was strongly Presbyterian, the government might quarter troops on you. Now, the troops would eat you out of house and home. They'd steal anything they could get their hands on. They might rough you up.
This was reason enough for the moderates not to want to be associated with the extremists. But soon any semblance of brotherhood would be completely extinguished. The extremist struggle was about to rise to a whole new level. On the 3rd of May 1679, a band of armed Covenanters on the prowl near St Andrews stumbled unexpectedly across Archbishop Sharp, the reviled traitor. Whether by chance or as they believed God's will, here was an outlet for the Covenanters' bloodthirsty fury. Sharp was dragged from his coach, shot, and then stabbed repeatedly. The crown came down fast and it came down hard. The assassins were executed, and royal troops scoured the lowlands in search of illegal conventicles, hoping to stamp out pockets of resistance. Expecting to find only the tattered remnants of the faithful, weakened by constant harassment and violence, what they actually found came as a considerable shock. The Covenanters were ready to fight back. Swelling the ranks of experienced soldiers from the civil wars was a new radicalized generation ready to die for their cause.
These people were prepared to be far more militant. They were kind of akin to the sort of Palestinians in the West Bank, young men who have a grievance against some form of persecution.
And among them was a university student called William Cleland. Cleland was an enthusiastic poet, but at Drumclog in Lanarkshire, he found himself making more of a mark with his musket and sword than with his quill.
At the conventicle at Drumclog, when word came that the dragoons were coming, a well-oiled plan went into action. The minister led off the women and the children to safety, and the men turned to fight.
On the Covenanting side, of course, there was William Cleland, who was to gain quite a reputation as a soldier. He had a good eye for the main chance. He realised what needed to be done in order to defeat the enemy, and he brought it off perfectly. Much to the chagrin and horror of the opposition, of the authorities.
For the radicals, victory at Drumclog was surely proof that God was once again with them in their struggle.
Nothing else but the free love of the Father is the beginning of our salvation. And Christ is he in whom our righteousness and salvation dwells.
but it was to be a short-lived victory. At the Battle of Bothwell Bridge, a mere 2 months after Archbishop Sharp's assassination, the extremists were resoundingly defeated. They were herded